Okay, good morning or good afternoon, everybody, depending on where you are in the world. We're just going to wait 1 minute for people to get into the room, and then we will start. I'll introduce our speaker, and she will share with us her views on what's going on in the DRC politically at the moment and where that is going to take us. You are welcome to tweet about the event if you so wish. You can use the hashtag DRC, and we are at @sire_info. So, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Stephen Groost, and I am the head of SIRE's African Governance and Diplomacy Program. Welcome. Today we have a really great speaker in Stephanie Walters, who has studied the DRC very closely for many years, and also has a real perspective on what's going on in that region. I'd just like to read you a little bit of her biography. Stephanie her research focuses on political and conflict dynamics in the Great Lakes region, foreign policy within the Great Lakes in Southern Africa, and elites and political change. She's currently writing a book about foreign policy towards the DRC, which will be published in the Insight series by Brookings Press and Chatham House Press in 2020. Stephanie has worked in over 30 countries as a researcher specializing in conflict dynamics and political economy for organizations such as the World Bank, the UN, the International Finance Corporation, and the Economist Intelligence Unit. Originally a journalist, she was the Mail and Guardian's Africa editor from 2006 to 2009, and editor-in-chief of Radio Okapi from 2001 to 2003. Prior to that, she was the DRC correspondent for the BBC, Reuters, and The Economist. She is also the research and editorial director of Okapi Consulting, an international organization that runs peace-building media projects in conflict zones. Stephanie holds an MA in African Studies from the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. So welcome, Stephanie, and we look forward to hearing from you. Just one word on the DRC. As we know, yesterday or the day before, President Tshisekedi took over the mantle of the African Union chairmanship from Cyril Ramaphosa. And my interest is in governance in Africa. And I heard from a pretty well-placed source that the DRC is seeking to join the African peer review mechanism, which would make it the 41st country to voluntarily join this instrument, which is trying to promote and protect good governance on our continent. So I wonder if during your remarks you may want to throw in a line of what you think that might be all about. But we're looking mainly inward today. We're mainly looking at what's happening inside Kinshasa and the sort of palace intrigues in the court of the DRC. So Steph, over to you. Also, sorry, just to say, if you'd like to put comments, you're welcome to insert them in the chat, and we can also use the Q&A function. Go ahead, Stephanie.
Thanks for the introduction, Steve. And you're absolutely right. We're doing a lot of micro focusing today because a lot has happened in the last 6 months in the terms of palace intrigue, in terms of who's who and who's in and who's out. And it's been a really incredible time. And what we have now in terms of the leadership of the DRC is very different from what we had about 6 months ago. So what I want to do today is go through quite a detailed, almost step-by-step review of how we got here. And I want to do that because I think with hindsight, it'll tell us a little bit about where we're headed and what the plan has always been. And it'll also, I think, reveal to us that it was, in fact, a very specific strategy that was in place and not really responses to particular crises. And I think that has some bearing on how we look at why we have what we have today and what that might mean for how functional it can be. Then I'll look quickly at who's in the new Union Sacrée, Sacred Union. It's an unusual term, but that's what Félix Tshisekedi is calling his new political family. Then I'll look at what's next and also some of the lessons learned that we can try and take away and see how what that tells us about Congolese politics. So I mean, where are we today? Today, we're in a situation that's very different from where we were at the beginning of 2020. As we know, the relationship between Félix Tshisekedi and Kabila started in 2019 when the two of them concluded a political alliance after the 2018 elections, which led to Tshisekedi being president, but Kabila still maintaining substantial control over the parliament and the Senate and also the political provincial governors. Now, in 2019, that relationship was something that we were all getting to know, and the two partners, in other words, Kabila and Tshisekedi, were playing it very nice. And in particular, Tshisekedi was, I think, trying very hard not to rock the boat, wasn't taking any kinds of bold steps. Things changed quite a lot in 2020. So from the very beginning of the year, we started to see some of the key people around Kabila, both civilians and military, being having someone moved from their positions, and action aimed at weakening the Kabila camp. And this already happening around March 2020, really Kabila camp, which I think for the first time really understood that perhaps this behind this political agreement it had struck with Tshisekedi, and that they might not be able to control Tshisekedi to the extent to which they had perhaps thought they could. And so that brings us to, I think, the middle of the year where the strategy really starts to begin. And I call it a strategy because we wouldn't be where we are today if this hadn't been an executed plan, and I think very clearly thought through from the beginning. So one of the, in middle of 2020, the 3 judges on the Constitutional Court. And the Constitutional Court has been a court that has been politicized for the entire duration, really, of Kabila's time in office. An institution for him in clinging to office and in validating many of the steps he took to consolidate power in
Steph, sorry to interrupt
in his time in office.
Sorry to interrupt you. We're just getting not great audio from your side. Maybe if you turn off your video, we'll be able to hear a bit more clearly. Thanks.
Okay, I'm really sorry about that. You never know what's going to happen, but I'm turning off my video now. Okay, let me know, Steve, if it happens again, and I'll try something else. Hopefully it's better now. So the Constitutional Court has always been a really important player for the Kabila government, and has allowed him to, or in fact allowed him to stay on in office, validating many of the most controversial decisions, including a very long delay in the elections. Now, the Constitutional Court was also vital in approving the political agreement that was made between Tshisekedi and Kabila, not explicitly, but in terms of it validating that Tshisekedi was the actual winner of the 2018 election, which of course, as we know, was heavily contested. So the Constitutional Court is an important institution in the DRC. When Tshisekedi effectively takes control of that court by nominating 3 new judges, he effectively takes away from Kabila the ability to continue to cling to power and the ability to guarantee a return to power, because the Constitutional Court is so incredibly important in things like validating elections and adjudicating electoral contests. And for me, that was already the point at which we were the seeds of doubt about the longevity and the coherence of the FCC, Kabila's political platform. That was already a moment where I think a lot of people started to have second thoughts about how much longer that political coalition would last. So I think that was a really shrewd move on behalf of Tshisekedi. Now, we know that the FCC tried to fight back against that, heavily opposed the nomination of these judges to the point where they wouldn't even attend the inauguration of those judges in August. So I think they themselves knew that this was quite a significant blow. We then have, as the next step in the strategy, in October, President Tshisekedi makes a speech, a national speech, where he starts to publicly speak really clearly about the blockage between FCC and cash. So the blockage in the ruling coalition. He puts it out there, he speaks about it and says that it's making governance of the DRC very difficult. So another stage. On November 2nd, Tshisekedi announces that he will be holding national consultations, a wide set of conversations with all manner of actors in the political and civil society scene. The church, the governors, all political parties are invited to these national consultations, which he holds one-on-one with these different constituencies. The FCC boycotts that process, but it does allow governors elected by, or governors from its political party to participate. So these national consultations touch on a whole range of issues, everything from the economy to instability in the East, but also touch on the question of how functional the ruling FCC alliance is. So those consultations take place. Tshisekedi announces at the end of those consultations a number of different initiatives that he hopes to take. And at the same time, we have on November 11th, a seemingly, or initially seemingly perhaps unrelated new initiative, which is a petition to remove from office the president of the National Assembly, Janine Mabunda, who is there on behalf of Kabila's coalition. She's being charged with financial mismanagement. And it's a petition that is coming from the opposition. Now, this, at first glance, this seems to be coming out of nowhere. It's not entirely clear where it's headed, but it becomes clear fairly quickly what the aim of this petition really is. On December 6th, Felix Tshisekedi again addresses the nation, and he speaks about how the majority in parliament, which is Kabila's parliament, Kabila's majority, has collapsed. He makes this announcement. It's unclear at that point on what basis he chooses to make that announcement, but he makes this assessment, and he says that it's time for a new majority to be concluded, and he says that he will in the very near future be nominating a formateur to identify a new majority in parliament. Now, this is really a very, very strong strike at the heart of of the way in which power had been organized there. At this point, there are a lot of questions about exactly whether it's constitutional what Tshisekedi is proposing, and on what grounds he's making that assessment. Again, it becomes clear within a few days. By December 10th, we have a vote in parliament to remove Janine Mabunda and her colleagues from the presidency and the leadership of the National Assembly. This vote is the way in which this vote pans out indicates that members of Kabila's majority voted against their own president. So they voted to oust their own president from their own coalition. And this then forms the argument, the grounds upon which Tshisekedi would argue that the majority, the FCC majority, has collapsed. His argument is, if there are people in the Kabila camp who have voted against their own president, it means that majority is no longer functional, which means we need a new one. And so there we have the basis for the argument that we have seen playing out in the last few weeks. Once that the leadership of the National Assembly is pushed out, we have an interim bureau that takes office, and we then start to see this really rapid disintegration of the FCC. I think at that point we already see Kabila withdrawing. There are, of course, a lot of protests coming from the FCC camp, but I think from behind the scenes, it's possible to assess that the FCC knows that it has lost control over this institution. And we see a lot of floaters already, a lot of behind the scenes talks, which of course had been going on for some time, about who from the FCC will join this new sacred union. And it's important to note at this point that floor crossing is not allowed in the DRC. So if you want to join a new political platform, you have to do so as an entire platform. If you as an MP choose to leave your party, you lose your seat. And this is one of they managed to get around this, but this is at this point one of the constraints to the formation of a new majority. Nonetheless, we see on the 3rd of January, Modeste Bahati Lukwebo being appointed as the formateur, whose job it's going to be to identify a new majority and put that majority together. We see in January another flurry of opportunistic political leaders leaving the FCC and aligning themselves with the Union Sacrée. On the 27th of January, Bahati Lukwebo submits his report about the constitution of the new majority to President Felix Tshisekedi. And on January 28th, we then see another another very strong attack on the FCC majority, where there is a petition against the Prime Minister Ilunga Ilunkamba on the grounds that he has not been able to lead the government and make substantive changes to the DRC in the 2 years in which he's been Prime Minister. This petition is then passed by 367 out of 500 votes. And the next day, Ilunkamba resigns. And this is really the end. This is the end of the FCC majority. We see the next day the election of a new National Assembly Bureau, which is led now by someone who is still officially aligned with the FCC, but is in fact part of the Union Sacrée. And we're now going to see a new government and a new prime minister coming in the next few weeks. So that's how things unfolded. It's quite a series of events. And I think that the reason, again, to mention all of that is because the sequence and the step-by-step nature of it shows us that there was always a design. These different petitions against different leaders from the FCC in National Assembly were not in response to particular crises. They were always intended to help break up within the framework of the Constitution and the legality of the country, the FCC majority, and to hand that majority to a new political platform led by Félix Tshisekedi. And so that's where we are now. That's today, Félix Tshisekedi fundamentally essentially controls parliament. He will control the government. There will be, of course, he will have a lot of say in the nomination of the new prime minister. And there's been a substantial shift of power away from Joseph Kabila and towards Félix Tshisekedi and people around him. Joseph Kabila himself has been very quiet since all of this started to happen. He's remained in Katanga, but he is the person who did say to his prime minister once the petition had been passed that he should resign. He did say, please go ahead and resign. But we haven't heard much from him. He's been functionally really sidelined by all of this. Now, what is the Union Sacrée today? What is the Union Sacrée? Who's in this thing? The majority of the people who are in this new political platform that is led by Tshisekedi are people who come from Kabila's former majority. So we have, again, entire political parties that left the FCC to join the Sacred Union. And we also have people who joined as independents. And again, how does this work? If there's no floor crossing allowed, the way in which they've facilitated this adherence is rather than calling the Sacred Union not a political party or a political platform, but a vision. And so effectively this is the little loophole that they created to get themselves the majority that they needed, because they couldn't otherwise have got it. And again, the Constitutional Court has played an important role in validating that process. So we have a lot of transplants from the FCC, entire parties, individuals. Then we have a whole group of divergent actors, and with them, of course, some of the big names like Jean-Pierre Bemba and his MLC, and Moïse Katumbi with his Ensemble, who together bring in about another 100 MPs. The UDPS is part of this with its coalition partner, the UNC. They have another about 40 seats in parliament. But the majority today is still former FCC transplants. And I'll come back to why that should be of concern or could be of concern. We have divergent actors who don't necessarily have a similar vision or a political platform upon which they've agreed, because there isn't really a political platform of the Union Sacrée, although some have argued that the results or the report of the national consultations could serve as such. But nonetheless, I think it's safe to say that today we have a wide group of divergent actors. I think the Union Sacrée, like the FCC before it, is a political vision, if we follow the language, driven by political interests and opportunism. It's not so different from what we had before. It doesn't necessarily mean that can't mean better governance, but it is very much the reality of how that coalition came to be, and that does matter. And again, I'll come back to some of the implications there. The reactions to this have been hesitant, and I think to some extent skeptical. Obviously for the UDPS and all those who are in the Sacred Union, it's a wholesale victory. I mean, really a knockdown victory. And Tshisekedi, Steve, you spoke in the beginning about Tshisekedi taking over the African Union. I mean, that's really the cherry on the cake for him to get that kind of international recognition at a time when he's really succeeded in wresting power away from Kabila. But internally, because of the nature, the political opportunism that has driven this, and also because of some of the concerns about how constitutional this has been, whether there's been manipulation of institutions in order to get us to where we are today, there is skepticism. I mean, I think that, you know, one of the reasons it matters so much how this process played out is because obviously if there was a manipulation of texts, if there was an instrumentalization of the Constitutional Court, there's no reason for us to expect that that won't happen again. And what we don't want is this to have been a simple shift from one political elite that manipulated institutions in its own interests to a new political elite that does exactly the same. I'll talk in a few minutes about some of the things that some of the benchmarks that we can look at to see what kind of a coalition we might be getting and what some of the important views. But I think that there are really good questions being asked about the constitutionality of this, even the judge's nomination, the dissolution of the majority, and the independence of the Constitutional Court. Obviously, the FCC is saying this is illegal, but its attempts to lobby international actors on its own behalf failed. And so at this point, there's really, they're kind of speaking in an echo chamber. This isn't going to lead, in my view, to any kind of international response. This is very much a domestic matter. But you know, there are others who say that if Tshisekedi had wanted fundamentally to change the political landscape, what needed to be done was that we had to go back to the drawing board and hold wholesale elections. So in other words, just call an election now, dissolve parliament, and that would have led us to an outcome that would have reflected the will of the people. Because if we remember, this crisis was born in that political arrangement that was made behind the scenes in 2018, when Martin Fayulu really emerged as the winner of those elections, but those elections were stolen from him. So I think that the partnership that we had between Kabila and Tshisekedi was always on very shaky ground. And it's really it's the origin of the crisis that we have now. So a lot of these things give us reason to be concerned about what lies ahead. Also, what reason do we have to think that the Union Sacrée will be better than its predecessor? I've mentioned some of the concerns about its composition, the fact that it's a very mixed bag, a lot of political opportunism and political interests. And of course, around the corner, we have in just 2 years, another set of elections in 2023. Now today, we don't have that built-in tension between Joseph Kabila and Tshisekedi working in a coalition, but also fighting each other for who gets to be candidate in 2023. But we have a lot of big hitters like Jean-Pierre Bemba and Moise Katumbi, who may in fact choose to contest those elections. And so how does that play itself out already now in a political coalition where eventually you'll have several leaders of political parties emerging as potential presidential candidates? There's some question about whether Bemba would be able to present himself because of the charges at the ICC, but that's a different story. In any case, we have political leaders who I don't think are going to be willing to simply take a back seat to Tshisekedi in 2023. There's also a question of what happens to many of the other parallel structures that Kabila still had some level of control over. And that includes, of course, the army. I think we can be reassured that in the midst of all this change, and it's been very obvious to observers in the DRC, we haven't seen the army step in on the side of Kabila. That's very positive. And the bigger question, or the next question then, is what will happen if and when Tshisekedi and his new coalitions try to dismantle some of the patronage networks and some of the networks involved in illegal mineral deals that do involve the army? Is that the point at which we start having to fear that there might be some sort of reaction from the security sector? Those are questions that we have to, or issues that we have to watch closely. In terms of the responses from the Congolese population that I've been able to assess to some extent, I think there was obviously a real aversion to Kabila. I mean, we saw that in the outcome of the election and before that with the protests in 2016, 2017, 2018. So getting rid of Kabila is not something that a lot of people will be unhappy about. But at the same time, I think that the population's really quite sick and tired of the elite games that have been played, the elite reshuffling that has dominated really 2021. There are big concerns about about an economic crisis, about a humanitarian crisis, about the security concerns in the East. So in other words, there are huge, huge challenges that the DRC faces. Obviously, Tshisekedi would argue, I can now address those better because I'm working with a team of people who are going to be cooperative. I think that remains to be seen. And I think that in terms of how much time he has to demonstrate that that's what this exercise is about, he doesn't have a lot of time. It's already 2 years into his mandate. And I think he really needs to show some real results very quickly. And so the pressure is definitely on him and on his coalition. Again, now just lastly, in terms of the priorities or in terms of some of the issues around which we can perhaps assess the real sincerity of this new coalition and its commitment to moving the country forward and really to improving governance, again, something that Tshisekedi has said was at the basis of all this change. Some of the issues are the reform of the Independent Electoral Commission, reform of the electoral law, real committed fight against corruption, no matter who is standing, who is accused. And we've seen some backpedaling on Tshisekedi's behalf this year on corruption amongst people in his inner circle. So it's something we need to watch closely. And obviously also human rights, freedom of assembly, freedom of expression, all things that will be increasingly important as we head towards the elections. But I think also important in terms of how the media is allowed to cover Parliament and the new union and how it performs. And then clearly economic development and stability in the East. Those are other things that really need to be priority issues that the government focuses on. In the immediate term, a small clue that we'll have to what kind of a governance we might get is the composition of the new government. Inevitably, in such a large coalition, there will have been a lot of horse trading about who gets what position in exchange for joining the coalition. So the juicy jobs like Prime Minister, Minister of Defense and Interior, those are going to tell us a little bit about who's really in charge of this coalition. And then I think the coherence, finally, of the Sacred Union in terms of its ability to agree on government action and its ability to take unified action in Parliament on some of these key reforms are also things that we will be watching from now to see what this new arrangement is going to give us. And so I'll leave it there. And if we have some time later, I can speak a bit about international responses and how this might play out or how this is going down with international actors. Thank you, Steve.
Thanks, Steph, for a real tour de force. You really know your subject well and you have great depth. Today you've shown me you have great depth as well as great breadth, because in previous seminars we talked a little bit about the region and what's happening at the macro level. So it's also very interesting to drill down into the local politics. I'm actually reading on a book called The Putin Corporation from the middle 2000s, talking about how Vladimir Putin came to power, but much more importantly, how he stayed in power. And there definitely are parallels for what's going on in the DRC. Okay, so we're starting to get a few questions in. I'll take them for the moment in the order in which they've come. The first one was from Talia Parker and says, do you think there will be contention between the FCC members, the transplants, that have joined the Sacred Union? So I guess, is there going to be internecine fighting between the various transplants? Or, what about the existing members of the Sacred Union? So maybe let's just take them one by one.
Okay, sure. Look,
do you want to maybe try put on your video again so we can see you? If it's going to be crackly, we'll take you off again.
Okay, I'm doing that now. Okay, cool. Yeah, look, I think that's a good question. And I think that it's entirely possible. I mean, that there will be contention. I think, let me start at a different place. I think that those who have left the FCC know that there's not a lot to be had from being part of the FCC anymore. And for me, that's the primary motivation for them to have left the FCC. These are people who could have run in a different platform in 2018. It's not that long ago. Kabila as a political actor hasn't changed fundamentally. And so, I would question what suddenly made them choose to join Tshisekedi. I'm not convinced that the people who in 2018 were fighting for Kabila to stay in power and for the FCC to stay in power, given the track record, which wasn't great, now suddenly think it's time to move to a new party for reasons of having to do with governance. I think it's about their own political futures. And so I think that's the important thing to remember. There's not a lot to go back to. And so what that means is that in many ways, these different MPs have to make this sacred union work. But in Congo, that's always been, the underlying factor has always been you make that work through positions, through juicy, ministries and nominations to different positions in the National Assembly. And there have been allegations of corruption, which I can't in any way speak to because I don't know if they're true or not. In other words, buying of people to come over to the Union Sacrée. I think there will be a lot of negotiation, a lot of having to cajole some MPs, and I wouldn't say just from the FCC, but also from other parties to vote in a coherent fashion. And that's always been an important feature of how the National Assembly has functioned. So yes, I think it's very possible that there could be divergences, and how those are resolved remains to be seen.
Okay, thank you. Next question comes from Stefan Fischler, and he's asking, knowing the amount of strategic assets in the DRC, which superpower does Tshisekedi rely on? If there are any superpowers left, actually.
Yeah, well, I mean, Tshisekedi in the last 2 years has grown very close to the Americans. The Americans have really supported him vocally, publicly. For example, when it came to the inauguration of the judges, obviously the presence of a U.S. ambassador at a ceremony like that is very meaningful, and the U.S. ambassador was present. There are new military accords that have been signed between the U.S. and between the DRC. There's just been Mike Hammer, the U.S. ambassador, has been very vocal. There have been a lot of high-level visits, and the U.S., I think, without necessarily providing anything in kind. In other words, there hasn't been a massive increase in U.S. support, financial support, has made it clear that Tshisekedi is their guy. Some people would argue that that's because they want to reclaim the country from China. China has a big influence there, of course, especially in mining, and because of the loans that have been given. And the Chinese foreign minister was recently in the DRC and has also given the DRC $2 million to support its presidency of the AU. So there's definitely an important relationship there. But if I had to say who's the most visible international ally of Tshisekedi's today, it's the Americans. And many people, analysts, have wondered, in aid of what, and hasn't Tshisekedi potentially overinvested in that relationship? I think that remains to be seen.
Okay, so Francois Conradi asks, why could Tshisekedi not agree with Katumbi and Bemba? Did they want too much? I'm not sure at which point in the timeline he's referring to, but yeah, why couldn't they strike a deal? Did they want too much?
Yeah, well, I mean, in the end, they did join. They joined the Sacred Union, but you're right that it took a while. It's only been since the end of January that they joined. They were among the last. They were also among the last to agree to sign the petition for the prime minister to leave. And I think, look, I mean, first of all, there's bad blood between them in the sense that in late 2018, when they all met outside of the country to agree on a unity candidate, they agreed on a unity candidate, which was Fayulu, and was fielding himself as a candidate. So there's a history there of broken promises. On top of that, I mean, these are two very major heavyweights in the DRC politics, and in many ways more well known until obviously president than Felix. So These are not the kind of people who just, easily join a coalition because they know what their value is. Able to stand for presidency. He wasn't allowed to stand in 2018 because he was found guilty of corruption at the International Criminal Court. And that's one of the things that, one of the rules is you can't have been found guilty of corruption if you want to be a presidential candidate. Now, it's obviously questionable if that ruling by the Court was really apolitical, but that is the ruling at the moment. And Bemba, I think also, knows his value, and he has a lot of MPs. That's why I cited the number of MPs. So he's important as a bloc, but I think he's also interested in spending some time rebuilding his businesses. And the question is, does he really want to get involved as a prime minister potentially in a government where the verdict is very much out? It's unclear how well that government is going to work. I mean, it could be a huge flop. And then in the urns, at the urns in 2023, everybody will want to have turned their back on this, and those who participated will be tainted by their participation. And similarly, there have been arguments that have been made similarly about Katumbi and what he wants. There's also talk about the fact that there was pressure put on Katumbi with regards to, his businesses and his ability to stay in the country. But ultimately, the leverage exerted by Tshisekedi seems to have worked enough to get Katumbi and Bemba to join the sacred union with their parties. So yeah, I mean, Katumbi was also under some pressure internally because he had a bunch of his MPs who wanted to sign that petition against the prime minister against his order. And so there were some intra-party intrigue as well. And I think that's something that we're likely to see more of, that some of these parties that have joined also won't remain as coherent as have been in the past. A lot of speculation about that. But again, we still have to see who the prime minister is going to be and who the key government people will be. And just a last word on that one. When it comes to the prime minister, with that loophole that they've created where you can still be part of the FCC but adhere to the sacred union, that's how they got an FCC person to be the new president of the National Assembly, but somebody who is pledged officially to be in the sacred union. So they're playing with the numbers still, but getting the loyalty in another way. And that may or may not be how they choose to designate the prime minister. That person may still come from the FCC. So we'll see.
Sounds like Game of Thrones, Kinshasa style. Okay, and on that note, Patience asks, can we really expect that Kabila will go down without a fight? I was also going to ask that question. Is he finished? Look,
I mean, I think Kabila has been fighting for some time. I mean, if we go back to 2018, he conceded that he couldn't stand for a third term. And I think it's partially because he didn't come up with an acceptable option in the framework of the Constitution. Then he conceded that he couldn't impose Ramazani Shadari, the FCC candidate, on the country. I think understanding that it would have been a bridge too far and that there very well could have been large-scale protests, which could have been very threatening to him. So he's conceded that. Clearly, though, he had hoped that by giving himself the majority in the parliament and by having this behind-the-scenes deal with Tshisekedi, he thought he could control this. So, I mean, there's no question that Kabila is surprised and shocked. Again, I think going down without a fight, I mean, the fight that we have today is that there are still a few people who are in his loyal crowd who are very much trying to, challenge this. They won't get very far, but they are still in parliament. There are 100 odd of them. That's not a tiny number. But I question what Kabila really has left to fight with and what he would be fighting for. Again, I mean, the thing that he always dangled was, we'll be back in 2023. And he was only going to be able to really do that by manipulating the Independent Electoral Commission and the Concord, and he's lost control of that. So I think he knows that he's been, I don't know, outsmarted, but for the moment, it's very difficult to see how he might come back from this. I certainly hope, I mean, we can't rule it out, but I hope it's not by using the army and manipulating also provincial, differences, because he's from Katanga. Of course, Katumbi is also from Katanga, so that is, and that's always been one of the the interesting dynamics that these two big heavyweights are from the same province. But I'm not really quite sure what tools he would use. And, let's not forget that Kabila has a lot of, potentially judicial issues he could face, corruption charges and beyond, charges on human rights. And I think one of the big fears of Kabila and his family, his biological family, has always been the International Criminal Court. And I have no doubt that those conversations about, potentially instrumentalizing those threats have been had. So he might have concluded that for the moment it's best to stay in the background.
Great, thank you. Another question: what do you think were the initial factors that drove the initial defections of FCC politicians from Kabila to Tshisekedi? What kind of sparked that, or is it part of the grand plan that you've laid out for us?
Yeah, I think it was always the grand plan. And I mean, a few years ago when we were just trying to figure this whole thing out, I wrote a set of scenario analysis where, to me, it always seemed that these two were on a collision course for 2023. And that Kabila, who at the time, in early 2019 was arguing, I'm going to be back in 2023 as a candidate. We are strong as the FCC. He was making his MPs and others take loyalty oaths and this kind of thing. I think he always knew it was going to be difficult and constant battle to keep that coalition together. And again, he was dangling, we may be out right now, but we'll be back. Because, it's true that for a lot of FCC people, the fact that they didn't get the presidency in 2018 was a shock. Obviously, not everybody was in the loop when that arrangement was made behind the scenes. And I think they really thought they'd come back to power. And so a lot of people had to be reassured. And that reassurance is no longer something that Kabila has the capacity to guarantee. He cannot guarantee that he'll be back in 2023. And so those people who are, so it's a sinking ship. And who wants to be part of a sinking ship? That plus, politics have always been linked to resources in the DRC. What kinds of resources can I get my hands on? And Kabila's resources today are much more limited than they once were when he was president. They'll be even more limited when he doesn't control the ministers that are in government. And so it's not really a winning team, the FCC. And for me, that is the key factor here. It's a push factor. It's not that the Union Sacrée was so attractive. Again, I mean it's a very mixed bag. And 2018 would have been the time where where those who have now moved to the Union Sacrée could have moved to the opposition, and they didn't do it. So for me, this is about power and what comes along with it. And Tshisekedi very strategically took control of the things that would have allowed Kabila to come back. So I think it's been a brilliant strategy. Where it will lead us is, I think, a different question.
Okay, there's another question by Stefan Fischler on what will be the impact of the AU chair on DRC politics.
To be honest, I don't think it's going to have a huge impact. So we know, because Tshisekedi has said it a few times now, what his priorities are. They're the free trade zone, they're COVID, they're, of course, silencing the guns and conflict management, and then a question of bringing back African artifacts and so on. He hasn't spoken about the Great Lakes specifically. We've always wondered, will his chairmanship of the African Union, presidency of the African Union, mean that the Great Lakes will be on the agenda or not? I'm tending to think probably at this point he won't put it on the agenda, because for him, in many ways, having put a lot of emphasis on positive relationships with his neighbors, I get the impression that Tshisekedi thinks things are going well. And so he might not want to, really push the envelope there on the Great Lakes, even though I don't agree that things are going well, and it would be a fantastic opportunity. I don't really see him taking that initiative at this stage, unless there's some kind of big conflagration between Uganda and Rwanda, or a new rebel movement that somehow, I think, gains strength. But I don't know. Now, in terms of Kabila's, of Tshisekedi's standing, I think we know that that the AU presidency it's what you make of it. It can be a rather empty one-year mandate, or you can try to push certain agendas, but it is always something that is recognition in some way or another. And so I think Tshisekedi will use it as a showcase, as a platform to project himself as an important statesman on the continent, who can lead and who's different from his predecessor. I get the sense that it's very much an image thing, although he has constituted a very good team of people who are experienced in regional politics and geopolitics and so on, to support him. So that's I think also very positive. But I don't think it's going to have an impact on DRC politics itself.
So now we're going to turn that the other way around with the next question, which is from Lisema Lekuana, saying, given the much publicized instability of the DRC for generations, will the DRC be able to steer and navigate the AU ship, the coronavirus pandemic, the free trade area, transnational corporations looting resources, and the human rights culture in the continent? Will they have the muscle given domestic challenges? I mean, just before you answer that, I was thinking that maybe being the AU chair also gives you a slight bit of protection in that other African countries won't want to upset or embarrass. There's a bit of that culture. So maybe he gets an easy ride for a year.
I agree with you, Steve. I didn't mention that. You're right. Absolutely. I think that it does make him a little bit more untouchable than your average head of state. And within the fraternity of the African Union, heads of state tend to be relatively untouchable to begin with. So I think that's true. In terms of whether or not they can steer all those things, I mean, that's what the commission really does. I think when I was saying earlier that the presidency sets a tone and can certainly, much like the presidency of the UN Security Council, you can put forward certain priorities and push those and maintain those on the agenda. But fundamentally, the work of tackling the coronavirus pandemic, the continental free trade zone, all of that's the work of the commission, really. Of course, I think Tshisekedi could again, he can put certain conflict zones on the agenda, but actually how the mechanisms of the African Union are not necessarily heavily steered or influenced by the presidency itself. And then you have the question about whether or not he's going to be distracted by domestic challenges. I think that's a very good question. I mean, I think that we had that question about Ramaphosa as well, because the domestic challenges in South Africa were huge even before COVID. And, how much appetite do you have for foreign policy under those circumstances? I think that Tshisekedi, because he's trying to burnish this image of himself, will put a lot of energy and time into it because it's important to him to have that image and to look like he's succeeding. Whereas I think Ramaphosa doesn't really need to bother with that so much. So I think that he'll make time, even though there are huge domestic challenges. But I don't think that he's going to make or break the AU's ability to enhance the continental free trade zone or make progress on the coronavirus pandemic. I think it's going to be much as business as usual. So yeah.
Okay. From Peter Fabricius, thanks, Stephanie. How do you think he pulled this off? Why did the FCC defect to FT? I know this was a strategy the US was pushing, but how important was that?
Thanks, Peter. I think I answered a little bit that question. For me, it's always been about what did the FCC have to offer after Kabila was no longer a president. And, in the first year, it had a lot to offer, MP seats, presidency of the National Assembly, plenty of ministries, and really in many ways business as usual for many of the Kabila people. Although not everybody. I mean, a lot of the big names really, just lost jobs and lost their standing. But again, I mean, in 2020, Tshisekedi made a point of repeatedly publicly going after these hardcore members, these pillars of the FCC power structure, and I wouldn't say publicly humiliating them, but publicly showing nobody's untouchable in that coalition. And things people started to get very nervous. I mean, in March last year, when I was last in Kinshasa, this was happening. And a lot of FCC people were running around going, Tshisekedi's overstepping his boundaries. He's constitutionally not able to do these things. I don't think they understood that Tshisekedi potentially was going to do this. I think they were very naive about Tshisekedi's political ambitions and weren't ready for him to really try and shake things up. Now, how important was the US? I mean, I think we all, if I can put it this way, many of us analysts from the very beginning tried to take an approach to this new arrangement and say to ourselves, how can we make the best of a bad situation? In other words, a legitimate president who's in a political deal with his former rival, where he's heavily constrained by a parliament that has a majority. How do we nurture something positive out of this? And so I think everyone's been trying to figure out how to do that. And part of that, or some people concluded that the strategy had to be to separate Tshisekedi from Kabila. I do think that had to be an element, because otherwise they were always going to be in a rivalry and you would have just gone around and around. But I think that the question of what Tshisekedi is going to do with all this power is still one that I don't have the answer to, and that I worry about a little bit. So I'm straying a little bit from your question, but I don't think yes, the US supported this. I think a lot of other countries went along with it and didn't stand up and say, we think this was unconstitutional, or we think this wasn't unconstitutional. And that's really the basis upon which anybody could challenge what's happened. It's not so much that it happened and that the majority changed. I mean, those are domestic matters, and it's not up to the international community really to necessarily comment or interfere. But I think that the concerns that a lot of people have about the constitutionality of a lot of these processes and the independence in particular of the Constitutional Court. For me, those are elements where the international community should be watching very closely. And clearly the US, for example, has chosen to look away from that. And nobody else, to be honest, has really raised their voice about how constitutional elements of this strategy were. Pretty key elements, but nonetheless just elements. And so I think the FCC fell apart because it was always going to fall apart once it knew that it couldn't have power. And Tshisekedi took steps that broke up that hold on power quite effectively.
Thank you. Interesting to see whether there will be more attention to Africa in general and DRC in particular from the Biden administration. He already sent a video note, which I thought was very nice, to the African Union. But again, he's got domestic issues that are going to consume him. So it'll be interesting to see whether the transactional nature of Trump's diplomacy takes a turn, and that comes back to the human rights question. So Judith McCullum says, thank you for the excellent presentation. Any predictions on what impact this could have on politics in the East? Because of course, this is happening in Kinshasa in the West, and 4,000 kilometers up in the Northeast, still a lot of instability in the DRC. How do you see that?
Yeah, it's a tough one to say. I mean, there are probably two elements one can focus on. I think that what we've seen in the past few months is that Tshisekedi does have the support of governors in the East, and that's important, even though they're FCC governors, and that's definitely an important factor. And some of them have even rallied to the Sacred Union. So that will make that relationship and communication easier. The Tshisekedi did campaign on trying to improve the situation in Eastern DRC, and hopefully, having now spent an inordinate amount of time on politics at the top in Kinshasa, one can again start to focus a little bit on, or a lot on what's going on in the East and a lot of the big challenges there. And clearly, I mean, that's a priority that remains. I mean, the ADF has been involved in more massacres in the last few weeks and months. That's a situation that's not under control. And so a lot of attention has to go to that. Now, of course, fixing the East is not something you do overnight. It doesn't matter who's president, that's always a long-term issue. The question of natural resources is fundamental to that. And as I said earlier, that is an area where there are a lot of interests that are linked to the Kabila government. And so dismantling that, how is that going to be possible? Is that something that Tshisekedi will even want to do? And I draw into that answer also the question of what the region wants to do, because I think, as I've said in other papers, there's a regional mafia that benefits from instability in Eastern Congo. It's not just Congolese, and that means Rwanda and Uganda. Does Tshisekedi want to upset Rwanda and Uganda by dismantling some of those mafia networks? I think that's part of the answer to the question about the East. But in short, And I think, again, the population is really key to this. The Congolese people are really pushing for that to be on the agenda along with economic development. So one can only hope that that the new government is responsive to that. But it's always going to be a long-term process to try and deal with Eastern DRC.
Okay, so we've still got just over half an hour. If you're still strong, Stephanie, and can keep going, we haven't stumped you yet, so we'll keep going. But I did want to say that our events team is going to be putting through a link to a very, very short survey that helps us evaluate whether we've delivered what you're expecting and helps us to improve. So please fill out that in the chat when it gets posted. Okay, so then the next question from Siwapiwe Madubela says, good afternoon, Stephanie and Steve. What is the current dynamic with Jean-Pierre Bemba, and what influence will he bring to the Sacred Union?
Well, I mean, the current dynamic is Jean-Pierre Bemba and the MLC are part of the Sacred Union. Again, as I said earlier, they were latecomers, and clearly, you know, the number of meetings between Tshisekedi and Bemba, I think, indicated that there was reluctance to join. We don't know if he's going to get a leading position in a new government. Jean-Pierre Bemba is somebody who is extremely influential. I mean, he, you know, managed to keep, I think he has 40 MPs, I have to look it up, but he managed to keep his political party going while spending 10 years at the International Criminal Court in prison. And I think that's not an inconsiderable showing. He has support primarily in the provinces where he's from, in northwestern DRC. And he's also a very well-known businessman. So he's certainly an important name, and his participation will be important to Tshisekedi, as well as if he hadn't participated, it would have been important that he didn't participate. So you want Jean-Pierre Bemba on your team. So yeah, what influence he brings is his number of MPs and just his own political standing and his political history, clearly, yeah.
And some charisma too. Okay, another person, Bruce Edwards, also asked about the instability in the East, which you've covered, but he did want to know particularly about the DRC's relationship with Rwanda. I don't know if you can comment on that. I'm sure you can.
Sure. Hi, Bruce. Yeah, I mean, the DRC's relationship with Rwanda, this was really something I was hoping would kind of be recalibrated once Tshisekedi took over, and over time, right? Again, because keeping in mind that obviously Kabila's interests in that whole dynamic are very strong. Now, Tshisekedi's made a huge effort to get along with Kagame, and obviously, you know, you'd be stupid if you were the head of state of the DRC not to make that effort. But the real question is, on what basis is that relationship, that new relationship, now taking place? And I use one example to in my analysis, which is that last year, we started to hear about, middle of last year, in fact, middle of 2019, rumors that there were Rwandan troops again in Eastern Congo. And over the course of 2019 and 2020, we developed evidence that indicated that in fact Rwandan troops were in Eastern Congo. And really, I think their objective was to go after some of the leadership of the Rwandan National Congress, which is General Kayumba's group. Now, this was never something that Rwanda denied it, Tshisekedi denied it. We now have, you know, the last sort of a bit of evidence, if we still needed one, from the UN Panel of Experts report, which came out in December and very clearly spoke about how Rwandan troops were in fact in the Eastern DRC. Now, if you are the president of a country and you have a relationship with Rwanda, and you feel that Rwanda has legitimate grounds to want to, you know, either send troops or ask you to do something about a rebel movement, there's no need for this to be an informal exchange. I mean, that's exactly what we've seen for the last 25 years in the region and in the Eastern DRC. Everything is informal. There's very little accountability. There's no transparency. And it tends to be because there are hidden interests and because it's also upsetting in many ways for Congolese to see Rwandan troops on their territory. So I find it, if I have to try and assess that relationship and how whether it's improved, and when I say improved, I mean improved for the stability of the DRC and of the region, then that particular dynamic worries me. I feel as though what Tshisekedi has done is walked into an old dynamic that was established with Kagame, between Kagame and Kabila, where Kagame tended to have the upper hand for a variety of reasons, and Kabila had an interest in maintaining the status quo, again for a variety of reasons, economic and political. And I'm not convinced that Tshisekedi has fully taken either the measure of that or feels that that's something that he wants to change. And for the stability of Eastern DRC and for the stability of the region, that's bad in my view. So, yeah, I think, I hope I answered that question.
Okay, so we're going to look now at three other actors in this drama. Didier van der Hasselt, who is the ambassador of Belgium in Pretoria, says, "Thank you for this detailed analysis. How do you assess South Africa's stance on the sequence of last year's events?" And then there was a question again from Siwa Piwe asking about the DRC and the EU, European Union, and its support for the DRC. And I'd like to just throw in Russia because for every shipwreck, there's a salvage company. So just would be interested if you can comment on those three actors. So South Africa, EU, and Russia.
Sure. Okay. Let me start with South Africa. So I think that South Africa's stance on DRC, and especially on internal matters, has always been very careful and very hands-off. So whenever it has come to internal developments in the Congo, South Africa has kind of said, look, this is a sovereign nation, we can't get involved. That's, for example, what they said in 2018, early 2019, as you know, Ambassador, when there was the big question of who won the election. And because the Constitutional Court, which was a DRC institution, said we think that Tshisekedi won, South Africa said, okay, that's good enough for us. And I think that is an attitude that has continued to dominate that relationship. Tshisekedi, of course, was here in December, and although it was formally a meeting about the handover of the AU presidency, it was really also obviously to get, I think, Ramaphosa on board. And I think that from what I understand, the South African government is okay with what's just happened. I think they feel fairly reassured that this was a peaceful change, a shift in the balance of power, and that it doesn't present massive risks for the stability of the Congo. And so I think in that sense, they're perfectly happy for it to have taken place. And that is an analysis that I also place within the context of the fact that I think that South Africa is, again, very preoccupied by its own domestic issues, understandably, and hasn't played a very big role in foreign policy on the continent, aside from its chairmanship of the presidency for some time, even when it came to its role on the Security Council. And so I think South Africa's in foreign policy on Africa's in, I don't want to say a lull, but it's quite low key at the moment, and kind of getting involved in the internal Byzantine dynamics of who's who and what's what is probably a bridge too far. And so, I mean, I think those of us who work in South Africa and on South African foreign policy have often tried to argue that South Africa should take a more leading role, not necessarily in DRC's internal politics, but in the regional politics. And I think South Africa still has a very natural role that it can play there, and a very positive and probably constructive role. But again, I think it's a question of time and resources and energy to take on those very difficult things.
Remember, it was also about the EU and Russia.
Yeah, I'm sorry, right. EU, look, the EU, I mean, it's a very important development partner for the DRC. The EU has just renewed its sanctions on, I think it's 11 of the 11 Congolese politicians, most of them, if not all of them, from the FCC. And so that is, obviously a significant part of the relationship between the EU and the Congo. And for a long time, I think that Tshisekedi had tried to, so we heard in the early days, the FCC was certainly trying to get Tshisekedi to lobby the EU to drop those sanctions. I think, how much Tshisekedi still feels like having that conversation with the EU at this point when he really doesn't need to is questionable. But that's, so the EU relationship with the old guard certainly isn't very positive, but I think it's quite positive with the new guard. And like I said, it's an important donor. And
Russia.
yeah, Russia. Yeah, Russia. I mean, Russia's not hugely present in the Congo. And it's not one of these sort of, jump out from behind a bush kind of powers that like it is in the CAR, where suddenly you have this important relationship and troops and weapons and so on. Obviously, it's a presence. And I think, again, often what we forget is that Russia and also China play a role at the Security Council in being able to protect some of these countries against more invasive or more, uncomfortable measures that might be coming from other members of the P5 or the Security Council. And I think that's really where Russia's played sort of a protective role over incumbents in the Congo and over presidency.
Thank you. So another foreign policy question from James Mackey, who I think is still at the European Centre for Development Policy Management in Maastricht. So James says, how is Tshisekedi seen by leaders in the neighboring countries, in particular the East? So I guess in the East African community leaders that we're talking about. And how do his relationships in the region set him up to manage the chair of the AU effectively or not?
Okay. All right. So I mean, Tshisekedi, even when he was still constrained by this majority of the FCC in parliament, even in the very early days of coming to power, Tshisekedi really emphasized regional relations. And by that, in particular, Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, and Angola. Again, I think he knows that those are countries that can make or break his presidency, that can create greater or less instability in the East, and that they're just players you want to have on board. And I think also from the start, it was an area, foreign policy was an area where Tshisekedi had more independence and was able to be, the person in the room, unlike Kabila. So he's emphasized those relationships a lot. I think I've spoken about the relationship with Rwanda. I won't go back into that, but it's under Tshisekedi, we've seen Kagame coming to Kinshasa. I mean, Kagame, standing over the coffin of Etienne Tshisekedi when he was finally brought back. I mean, that was a very powerful image. I think, things like Rwanda Air, new Rwandan ambassador. So that relationship is something that Tshisekedi has emphasized a lot and has tried to nurture a lot. And interestingly, I mean, there was recently a spat with the Rwandan ambassador around this question of the UN mapping report and some of the comments made by Mukwege, which which I think are an interesting indication of just how Rwanda sees DRC, because it was a very defensive and comments that were made by the Rwandan ambassador that you would know would upset Congolese, and that did in fact upset Congolese. And coming so soon on the heels of a resumption of a relationship, I think it tells us a little bit about how Rwanda still seems to feel that it has the upper hand. Uganda, it's interesting because Uganda is, so Rwanda and Angola are playing the role of mediators, and it's part of a quadripartite summit to try and patch up the relationship between Uganda and Rwanda. I think that, for Museveni, Tshisekedi is a new player whom he needs to get to know. I think there's a decent relationship there, but I don't think that either Kagame or Museveni really think of Felix Tshisekedi as sort of an elder statesman who they would really allow to play a role in their internal dynamics between the two. And I fear that the dynamic is still that, the person who's in charge in Kinshasa is somebody who is weaker than other players in the region. And that may change specifically with regards to Uganda a little bit faster than it changes with regards to Rwanda. I don't see it changing with regards to Rwanda really at all. Kagame is also the person who has proposed that DRC and join the East African community. There is definitely competition between, for example, East Africa and Uganda, Rwanda, and their desire to have greater influence in Congo than, for example, SADC. of which DRC is a strong member, and the only Great Lakes body of which DRC is a member is the ICGLR, which is a relatively weak regional mechanism. So pulling DRC into the EAC, in my view, is more about political control than it is about anything else. Obviously, we have a long border and there are a lot of trading possibilities, but that's how I see that initiative by Kagame, is to try and sort of wrestle DRC away from SADC, because in the past, SADC has often come to the support of the DRC when DRC has been threatened by Uganda and Rwanda. So that's this dynamic that's been there for a very long time. How does it set him up to manage the chair of the African Union effectively? I mean, I think, it's going to be, I think, a club of people who welcome him in. Obviously, Kagame, when he was chair, and all the sort of reform efforts at the AU are something that Tshisekedi will want to move forward, and that's how Kagame is somebody who has been active at the African Union. So I think he's not going to have a hard time with any of the heads of state, either from the Great Lakes or East Africa or other parts of the continent at this stage.
Okay, thank you. Then Mohammed Diata asks, with 2023 approaching, how can Tshisekedi make the Sacred Alliance work other than through creating another type of patronage network and subverting key state institutions? I mean, those are the rules of the game, I guess. What are the consequences going forward? And I think that's really important. You talked about, you can think of other countries where judges have been rammed through onto the Constitutional Court and elections have been alleged to be stolen, and you have somebody who wants to come back in 2024. You may know who I'm thinking of. But institutions are meant to endure. So what are the kind of long-term implications? I guess that question is asked. Now, is there any different way to play the game, or is he going to have to play the patronage politics again? And what does this mean, big picture?
Yeah, it's a really, really good question. I think I'll take first the part and about it. How do we make the Sacred Alliance work, right? So I'm assuming that, well, I'm not assuming, but let me say I'm going to answer that question from how do we make the Sacred Alliance work for the DRC, not just stick together, to be a political platform. I think that there are ways to do that. I think it depends again on what Tshisekedi wants. If Tshisekedi truly wants to change the way the DRC is governed, he can do that. And he can do that with the people he has now. And I'm not saying because they're all going to take their orders from him, but because they now have an interest in keeping that sacred union alive and successful, right? So how do you define success in the context of the Congo, beyond just being an MP? I mean, I think that there are a lot of issues where there's congruence between Tshisekedi. There could be congruence between Tshisekedi and the national agenda. So things that need to be done, things like combating corruption, things like economic development, things like human rights, where if you set the tone in a particular way, so on human rights, it's a question of setting the tone and creating the security, making sure you rein in the security sector, and that's something that Tshisekedi can do and has shown he can do, but sometimes also has shown he doesn't want to do. Things like corruption, again, he's taken some very, very bold steps, for example, against his own coalition partner, to tackle corruption, and more recently, even against people like Abayuma from Jekamin. But then there are other people who were closer to him against whom he's dropped corruption charges. But I think that if he truly, he now doesn't have to balance this in the same way that he used to, where the assumption was always that whatever action he took was going to be a threat to his rival. Today, we're starting off in a slightly different way. And if you say to yourself that there are other people in the Sacred Alliance who want to come back to office and want to be elected in 2023, then you can also say then they have to deliver on a certain number of things. And so there's a collective interest in delivering on key things like economic development, corruption, human rights, and then undertaking some of the really important reforms on the CENI and on electoral reform, and potentially even on the Constitutional Court. Now, I think there's two slightly different things, right? So the stuff that needs to be done on human rights and corruption, can be done through the government. So once we have a government and a prime minister, that will be their job. Now, with regards to how we handle reforms, those are all going to be taking place in the National Assembly, where Tshisekedi has to deal with a lot of different, he has to sort of corral a lot of different political parties. Some of them will be easier to corral than others. And for example, if you look just at the numbers of the MLC and the Ensemble, so in other words, Bemba and Katumbi, you have something like 110 or 100 odd MPs just from those two parties who can make life difficult for Tshisekedi, or who can, for example, push for independent electoral reform, even if that's not Tshisekedi's actual agenda. So in some ways, yes, the balance of power has shifted completely from Kabila to Tshisekedi, but Tshisekedi still has to contend with the realities of a parliament that he doesn't control in terms of his own set of MPs, and then rival, or maybe not even necessarily, let's not call them rivals yet, but other politicians who may feel that actually delivering and doing the right thing is their best chance of success. And then, of course, there's also the possibility that there are politicians who deliver because they feel like that's what they should be doing as public servants. And so, so there is a chance that we can still nurture out of this very divergent new sacred union some good outcomes. And obviously, we get the best outcomes if Tshisekedi is truly committed to a free and fair election in 2023, and to making sure that the population can say, that guy didn't do his job, and therefore I'm voting somebody else. I can't say today that I feel 100% confident that that is what Tshisekedi wants. But it won't be as easy as he might think for him to continue to control those institutions, because he has to deal with all these different players. So that's going beyond, I think, the specter of the patronage network. There are going to be, in my view, a lot of, and I think the patronage issue is particularly acute when it comes to the FCC transplants, right? Because why else are they there? They're there because they think that being in a new patronage network is going to be better than being in a defunct patronage network. Doesn't mean they can't be converted to be effective members or more effective members. But there's going to be a lot of behind the scenes. I mean, the Katumbi team, the Ensemble team can also try to get those guys on board against or for Tshisekedi. So there's a tremendous amount of movement that's going to be going on. The consequences, I think, as I said, I think it's probably safe to say that had we continued with the FCC cash alliance the way we had it before, we would not have seen reform of key institutions, because inevitably FCC wanted to come back to power. Bottom line is that today we have a lot of uncertainty, but there is more opportunity and potentially more chance that we'll get some good reform out of this new arrangement. And we will know that, I think, relatively quickly. And we'll know who are the critical voices and how far those critical voices are going to be tolerated and what they can push for also pretty quickly.
You've touched on this, but Showers Mwawa asks, do you have a sense of public opinion towards this new coalition? Because we've talked a lot about elites. What about the ordinary Congolese? Are they just sort of watching this as a soap opera? Are they taking to the streets? Are they getting ready for the next election? Are they supportive or opposed? And how do we know?
Yeah, no, obviously, how do we know? I mean, I think, you know, hopefully there'll be some surveys done in the near future. I haven't been to Kinshasa since any of this happened, so I take my cues from what I've been reading and some of the vox pops and things. I think that the truth is that people in Congo know their politicians well, and they know that politics is about power and opportunity and resources. So no one is duped, I don't think, or naive about what this is all about. And so people are sort of saying, yes, we're happy that Kabila is out, and that was the objective of 2018 anyway. But, you know, can we move on to the business of actual government now? And Tshisekedi gave a speech again. He's been doing a lot of speeches lately. I can't remember, but it was sometime in January. And the sort of feedback after that was, okay, can we move on from this whole, you know, majority thing? And can we talk about the East? And can we talk about, you know, for example, that the World Bank has just suspended its first 100 million tranche to support free education because it's concerned about financial mismanagement. You know, these are the things that people are keenly aware of. and a sustained economic crisis, a tiny, tiny little budget for a country of that size. So people are, I think, okay with what's happened. So in other words, there isn't like, protests in the street. People aren't running out and saying this is a mini coup d'etat in progress. But I think they've had enough now, and I think there's a sense that we need to move on to other things now. So that's the feeling I get.
So next question, we've got about 10 minutes left. So we've got through most of them. This is from Roland Ngam from RLS. How strong is Tshisekedi's position, considering that Kabila still has powerful allies in the army and in the Chinese state-owned cobalt mines? And how likely is Tshisekedi to appoint a commission to look into the pre-election violence before the last elections?
Okay, sorry. How much support does he have in the army, and then China and the cobalt
mines?
Okay, and then the last one is commission. Okay, right. So Tshisekedi made some shifts in the army over the course of 2020, and put in place a number of different people. Whether a number of different people were so key Kabilists were moved out of the key positions, and he brought in some new people. I think it's still an area where he certainly doesn't have the kind of network or the kind of relationships that Kabila had, and that would take a very, very long time. But we also have to make a difference in the Congolese army between the elite, the officers, those who are in control, and then the rank and file. And the rank and file, like many Congolese, are completely impoverished, barely paid, poorly equipped, and still asked to defend the country. And I think many of them, are rather fed up with that situation. And so, and what we haven't seen in my view, the moment when we could have seen the army getting involved has passed. It doesn't mean they can't get involved again at some point, but all the stuff that I outlined at the beginning, it was slow, but we knew where it was going. And I think if you had wanted to prepare an armed response to that, it would have been possible to do that in that time frame, and it didn't happen. Now the question is, did Kabila say don't do anything, or did the army just conclude, or did the army not take its own initiative? I mean, those are different questions. But so I don't think the army at the moment, in my view, is a real threat to Tshisekedi, but that can change. I mean, certainly that can change. China, look, China has huge interests in the DRC. It controls most of the copper and cobalt mines, the industrial mining sector in Katanga, and it's always going to be an important player, especially with the loans and the money for infrastructure deals. So I wouldn't say, but I mean, China, as we've seen in a number of different crises, doesn't really get too attached to individuals. It tends to deal with a country and then with the commitments that country has to it and that it has to that country. I mean, it didn't bail out Robert Mugabe, but way back when. And I don't think it really minds necessarily who's in charge in Kinshasa, as long as it's able to maintain its deals. So that would be my answer to that. And then how likely is it that there'll be a commission to look into the violence before elections? I don't know. I don't know whether that's something that
we got you finally. We stumped you.
But I would think that that would be the kind of thing that would really upset the army and the police. And some of the people who were involved in that violence, of course, are the same people who are sanctioned by the EU. So it's already in progress. And in many ways, I think it would be easier for Tshisekedi to allow that to be an external process than to try and take it on board on an internal. It might still be a bit risky at this stage. And there are other things he could be looking at in terms of corruption and violence. And there has been violence against the population also since he's been in power. So we have to also remember that.
So from Emmanuel Mukendi, she said, excellent analyst and authentic account of the situation. So thank you. And her comment was that Tshisekedi has just been a smart politician and he's done what the people wanted. So Sven Schwersensky asks, if there was a grand master plan, and maybe we're going to wind down now, but there's still a couple of questions. If there really was a grand master plan, what was the event that decided Tshisekedi to get it rolling, or was he always on this timetable? Was there Was there a spark? I mean, you've argued against, you argued for the grand plan that was very well set out. But was there something that shifted, that did the continents misalign that allowed him to get going? Or again, was this on the timetable?
Look, I think that there wasn't an event or something that, it wasn't as though suddenly Kabila went too far and Tshisekedi said, that's it, I've had it. I need to do something about it. I think it was about how comfortable he felt, how safe he felt. And I think the measure of his safety was something that was related to the international support that he was getting. And I do think that the US, to go back to Peter's question, had a big role to play there. They certainly made him feel like, I don't know if you can call it a safety net, but like it would be on board. And of course, when the US is on board, that's a lot of, that's important. And so I think that it was about that. I think it was about feeling comfortable enough to go after some of these big names within the Kabila coalition, make some changes. Someone like Delphin Kayimbi, who was the head of military intelligence and a very senior military person who was called in for questioning and removed from his job and then died under very suspicious circumstances 2 days later. But you go after someone like Kayimbi, that's going to the heart of the Kabila team. And that happened in early 2020. And I think so gradually, and then testing the waters, what does that lead to? Where does that put, where does that put us? What is the response from the army, for example? So I think it has been gradual, but I think that it gained momentum and Tshisekedi felt safe enough to do it. And he certainly, it's a bet that he has won in terms of, the outcome.
Another question from Stefan Fischler. Does the increasing emphasis of the EU and the US on good governance make DRC look more seriously, does it look east? Does it look towards non-Western partners? You've argued that like every country, you have to balance this. It's not, you have to balance your relations with outside powers. But, does that pressure for good governance or that expectation make other partners more attractive?
It's a good question. I would say that right now for Tshisekedi, the EU and the US are extremely important. And alienating either and all the others that go along with that would be a really stupid move because he's got them on board. And there's no real interest at this point in violating human rights and suppressing media freedom. It's a very costly thing to do. And I don't think that that for the purposes of what Tshisekedi is trying to achieve, which is make himself look like a champion for good governance and for democracy, it's really in his interest to start acting in that way or to turn away from those countries and towards China. I don't see the value of that for him at the moment. Things again could change, and I think that if we start to get to the point where we see real manipulation or obvious, like intolerable manipulation of the Constitution and of the Constitutional Court and playing around with legal frameworks, we then might start to see the US and the EU and others becoming more vocal. I think a lot of the stuff that I would consider to have been questionable and that other, constitutional experts consider as questionable are just too small and under the radar and were in aid of a bigger picture. So the ends justify the means. But if we start to get to the point where that's no longer the case, then those relationships would be threatened. But let's be clear. The US and the EU have dealt with governments all over the world for many, many years, especially in Africa, that have committed all sorts of human rights violations. So it's also about what the interests of those countries are. And I think Tshisekedi right now looks like the good guy and is the good guy. And I don't see that ending anytime soon.
Okay, we're going to end with the last question from Peter, very, very specific. Did Tshisekedi have anything to do with the US taking Gertler off the Magnitsky sanctions list?
Well, I'm glad that Peter thinks I might know the answer to that, but this might be the one where I can't say for sure that I know that that's the case. It wouldn't surprise me. It really wouldn't surprise me. It's the kind of thing, it would be smart to do that. But from what I understand, that's still very much, that was at the end of the Trump time, and it's very much back on the agenda to put him back on it. So in a way, why would Tshisekedi have done that at the, maybe he thought, okay, let me take the chances with Trump and I won't get the same with Biden. But I don't know. I mean, I don't know. And I don't think Gertler is out of the woods yet. And he's not, it's not just the Magnitsky sanctions list. I mean, Gertler faces a number of different other hurdles that will make it difficult for him to just continue with the status quo. So, but I can't say yes or no. I don't know.
Great. I'm glad we stumped you finally. Stephanie, thank you really for your time and your interest in setting up this event. We struggled a little bit for a date, but we're glad that we finally, that we found one, and it's very timely. As I said, your breadth and your depth of knowledge is really impressive, and I think your analysis and reading of the situation is really brings a lot to the conversation. So thank you. Also like to thank Dumi in our events department, who's been running the controls in the background. If you haven't filled in the evaluation, I think I should probably post it one more time, or you can go up in the chat. And thank you to the audience. We had very good participation, excellent questions, and we wish you all the very best for the rest of your week. SIRE has a lot of these sorts of events, so please join us when we advertise them. And it's really great to get people from all around the world who have participated today. So thank you very, very much, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you, Steve.